Good morning, everyone. We are continuing our lesson on the genealogies. I wanted to say a few more words about that due to the fact that this is the introduction to the book of Chronicles. It's 9 chapters of intro, and it helps really set up the theme or the overview of the rest of the book. So I think it's important that we dive into it and discuss some of those things. Then if we have time, we're going to make our way into chapters 10 through 16, and what we're going to do is, because some of those stories we're very familiar with, we're going to look at it from a theological point of view, from how it plays into the story or the narrator's agenda with the book of Chronicles. So we left off with the question of the summary of these 9 chapters of genealogies and had a lot of good things to say about that. And I wanted to start with this question of what does the genealogy from Adam to the post-exilic period reveal about God's overarching plan for humanity? I'll open up the floor and then I'll have some things to say about that. Does anyone want to deal with what the narrator is doing by starting with Adam and bringing them all the way to this point in their history? Go ahead.
When you look at 2 Peter, where he says, before the foundations of the world, Christ was foreordained to come. When you read this, it should cement our faith in the fact that this was his plan even before we knew. Because with Satan as the spiritual enemy of God, God knew he was going to seek to destroy the life that God had created, especially the one that he had created in his image.
Yes.
This is just the foundation of the fact that this was God's plan all the way along.
Yeah, absolutely. And he is faithful to that plan. He can overcome any obstacle that man throws him, whether it's sin, whether it's judgment, whether it's the exile. You know, I think about the fact that he starts with Adam and then he's going to move into some familiar Bible characters, like Noah. And that, along the way, is going to remind us of the stories of, hey, I remember, at least for the readers here reading for sure, I remember reading about Adam. I remember what position Adam put us in. And he was banished from the garden. There was an exile, so to speak, for him. Then we read about how sin progressed, and God had to eventually judge the entire world by sending a flood. And so we remember the great Noah and his righteousness and how he found favor in God's sight. And he was saved because of his obedience. So as we're reading through the genealogies, and especially the original readers here, as they're reading through the genealogies, they're being reminded of, they're learning lessons along the way, but they're also seeing God's faithfulness. But I really think that one of the main purposes of the genealogies, and we're going to get into this with the next question about the practical roles, is that the genealogies is about identity, God's people being identified with him. And they needed to know that despite the exile, coming back into the land, they're walking into the land and everything is in a great heaps of ruin, as we learned in the book of Kings. We've been banished for 70 years or so in a foreign land with foreign gods and foreign king, and we don't have a king reigning over us. What's our identity? Who do we belong to? Who are we? Well, we're God's people. We're God's chosen people. And so we've talked about the Davidic covenant that's going to be running through this, that theme. And obviously that's going to be about God's chosen king. But the genealogy is about God's chosen people. And their identity goes all the way back to Adam. God starts in the beginning. And he says, hey, I have formed you as a nation. I have carried you along from the beginning. And now they've got a new beginning. And that new beginning is going to be that restoration, where they're going to come back into the land and they're going to rebuild the city and the temple and the walls. And they've got, this huge project ahead of them. But it's a new beginning for them. And so they have those different creation accounts that they're seeing as they go along. And it's Matt, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Okay. Just make sure I had your name right there. To Matt's point there also about the Messiah. You think about Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. We've learned here that that is the first glimpse of the gospel of Jesus, who he doesn't identify as Jesus, but we know it is Jesus, is the one who is going to crush the head of Satan. And he is the promised deliverer. He is the one who is going to deliver them from the covenant curses that Adam and Eve, and all of humanity for that matter, received. And so the people are tracing that promise. We looked at that last week in Genesis chapter 5 as Noah's father thought that maybe, hey, he is the one who's going to bring us rest from these curses. But it wasn't Noah, not him, not ultimately. Despite the fact that he was obedient, despite the fact that he was righteous, well, he brought sin into the world. In fact, after God flooded the earth, and then when Noah steps off the earth, there's this new creation, so to speak. There's righteousness in the land. Everything has been renewed. Noah immediately sins with drunkenness, and his sons sin. And so sin rushes right back into this land of righteousness. So it's not Noah, it's someone else. And as the genealogies are tracing, from us looking to the genealogies, we see them tracing Jesus. Well, that's essentially what they're doing, is they're tracing that seed of, okay, is it Adam? Is it Noah? Is it David? Well, maybe it is David, but then we see this great king who gives into the sin of adultery with Bathsheba and then the murder of Uriah. It's not David. He's not the one who's ultimately going to deliver us. Maybe it's Solomon, but Solomon turns his heart away from God. So the genealogies are tracing this seed, and it's telling the reader this promise is still alive. And despite all the generations that have gone, despite all of the wickedness in the world, all the obstacles that God has had to go through, nothing is too hard for God to carry out his promises. And really, the genealogy in chapter 9 ends with this idea of going right back into David, the Davidic covenant, and it's going to be how God is going to fulfill that seed promise. And in fact, along the way, so Genesis 3:15 is a seed promise. Abraham, chapter 12 of Genesis, is a seed promise. The Davidic covenant is a seed promise. So it's just that over and over again, God keeps reminding the people of the seed promise. But then there's another thing going on here in the overarching plan for humanity, and that is going back to Genesis 49. You have Judah, who is promised that his tribe is going to, the scepter will not depart from him, and he will be a ruler over the people, and all the peoples will be obedient to him. Well, as you read through Chronicles 1 through 9, what do we find? The writer is tracing the line of Judah. Judah is emphasized, is going to be a heavy emphasis throughout Chronicles. And the reason being is God has another promise, and that is that Genesis 49 promise about Judah. So there's multiple promises going through these genealogies. Again, as we mentioned last week, this is not just a list of names. There's purpose to why he's giving us these names, and it's for us to trace them and to be reminded of these promises and to see them ultimately fulfilled. Okay, anything else on that as far as the overarching plan? Okay, what practical roles, beyond showing the covenant faithfulness of God, did genealogies play for the community, for them, in those restoration efforts? And so I guess you could say, in other words, what is the point of 9 chapters of genealogies outside of showing the covenant faithfulness of God?
A couple of things that I see is that it identifies the tribes who could associate their territory that belonged to them as they return. It also emphasizes the genealogy of the priests so that they can reestablish the worship.
Yes. Those are the two of the main like practical roles for the people. We're coming back into the land. Who gets what land? Because remember, the Abrahamic covenant, they're going to get the land. The tribes are, we start to see in Joshua and forward, the tribes are getting the land. Well, we've lost the land. How do we, who's going to get what? So, yeah, you've got that going on there. So that's important. All about that identity again. We are identified with Abraham. We are identified with David. So you'll see that theme throughout the genealogies. But also as far as worship. And Chronicles is going to have a lot to say about worshiping God. We're going to see that specifically in chapters 10 through 16, where David is going to organize worship in temple, or not temple necessarily, but singers and musicians around the Ark of the Covenant, which is then going to foreshadow temple worship. But there's a big emphasis on worship. We have to be God's people, number one, to be able to offer acceptable worship. But we also have to be united. We have to be obedient. We have to have the right characters, which is the priest, to be able to, and not just any priest, but from the line of Aaron, the Levites, we've got to have certain men who can help offer us this worship. So all of that is important as they are returning to the land. And let's see, turn with me to Ezra chapter 2. Ezra chapter 2 is a really good example of what we're talking about here, about that worship and the necessity of having the genealogies so that those original returnees from Babylonian captivity would have an idea of who could offer that worship. So it says in Ezra chapter 2 and verse 59, now these are those who came up from Tal Mela, Tal Harsha, Kerib, Adon, and Immer, but they were not able to declare their fathers' households and their fathers' seed, whether they were of Israel. Look at verse 62. They searched in their genealogical record, but they could not be found. Therefore, they were considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. So here were men who came back from exile. They could not prove that they were of a certain line, the line that is allowed to be priest, the line of the legitimate line there. They could not prove that, and so therefore they were excluded from the priesthood. So if you remember going all the way back to the book of Exodus, only certain men, you had the line of Aaron and his sons could be priests. They were the only ones who could minister to God in those particular matters. If you cannot prove that, then you cannot offer that worship. And if you are trying to offer that worship, then you are essentially like Saul, who is trying to take it upon himself to offer worship to God. And then you will be rejected. So they were excluded, and that was a practical role there of the genealogies, was to prove who could be the head of that. Okay, any others that you may have saw? All right. I think that ultimately those cover it, and it's just, again, going back to the Abrahamic covenant, helping us realize who is actually God's people through his lineage. Now, as far as the hope that it would provide, we've talked a little bit about some of those things already with the overarching plan of God. But I do think that as they're looking to their past, as they're looking to the present, and then what the genealogies are doing is pointing forward to a future, and that future is the fact that they have returned to the land, and the genealogies have that theme of the Davidic covenant, which again is an everlasting covenant. So as they're looking forward to that, I believe that the genealogies is going to offer them not just encouragement in their present situation, but confidence moving forward. They can have confidence in all of their endeavors. They can have confidence in the restoration, in their worship. Why? Because God has kept his promises. God is seeing to this redemption. He's making sure that they are going to be redeemed and brought back into the land. And they're seeing all that play out in real time. So it just gives them that confidence and that hope as far as their identity with God. All right. How do the genealogies in 1 Chronicles 1 through 9 set the stage for the story of David in chapter 10, where his story begins to play out? Any thoughts on that?
What you have there in chapter 9, or rather chapter 10, is a retelling of what we find in 1 Samuel 31, the death of Saul. And so I think what you have there is here God has put this man into power, and his faults have come to light. And so he's going to take him out of the way and make way for a faithful king. And I'll say something else too. I've been sitting here thinking about. I had noticed this when we were reading through it. I couldn't make anything of it at the time, but I've been looking at the fact that you have Benjamin mentioned more than once.
Yes.
In Chronicles. They get a brief mention back in chapter 7, and then we have all of chapter 8 devoted to Benjamin. The focus there seems to be Saul, but then we even have a lineage that's after Saul that comes from Mephibosheth's son Micah. And we have all of these descendants that continue to live because of David's mercy. So I wonder if that's not a little bit of a building up the character of David there, as we're starting to get a running start into chapter 10 and 11.
Yeah. That comment, that question is so easy. I'm gonna let Marshall handle that one, but no, I'm just kidding. No, I do see some of that going on as far as Dave. So one of the things I see in chapter 9 is going to talk about all Israel. So there's going to be this idea of, and we're going to really see it play out in chapters 11, 12, and 13, I think it is, about unity under the reign of David. So I think there's part of that is going on there, leading up to that unity of all Israel. But then you also have the tribes that were all broken up with the divided kingdom. And so you had the 10 go to the north, and you had Judah, and you had Benjamin, you had the Levites. So I think all that plays together as well. But I do need to admittedly do some more studying on how the Benjamin line plays out in these 9 chapters. Other than the initial thing that I see is it's just a contrast of it is setting up the line of Saul, who is the very first king of Israel, because it's part of telling the history of Israel. That's what he's doing through genealogies, telling the history of Israel. So he's setting them up. The Benjamites come in to bring about the first king of Israel. To your point, he fails because of covenant unfaithfulness. Here comes now the rise of David, which is the contrast. So I'll have to give some more thought to that. It's really hard to study 9 chapters of genealogies, as you know. But anyway, Marshall, you got anything else on that one? Nope. Okay. Anyone else? Yes, sir, Mr. Matt.
It was pointed out years ago for me that when you read 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, it is the physical history of the nation of Judah. But as you go into the 1st and 2nd Chronicles, that's more along the lines of the spiritual history. And David played a strong part in that, in how he set up the kingdom, physical kingdom, but it was to be one that was wholly devoted to God. And of course, as we know, as long as they kept God in their hearts, they prospered. And when they turned from God, that's when they faced his judgment. But then when you look at the fact that we read several times throughout Scripture, David was a man after God's own heart. That's the spiritual aspect of man.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I see the breakout or the contrast between Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Absolutely. All right. So you do have again the line of Benjamin that is introducing Saul, but you also have, as I said, this unified nation, all Israel. I think it's interesting throughout the genealogies. He doesn't really deal with the divided kingdom. He views this whole restoration as affecting all of Israel, because really Israel is God's people. Whether they're following Jeroboam or Rehoboam or whoever, whether they've been taken into Assyrian captivity or Babylonian captivity, whether they're of the north or the south, they are God's people. They are all of the line of Abraham. And ultimately, the prophets are going to want that unity. There's a new covenant coming to the house of Israel, to the house of Judah. It's about bringing the nation together, that united kingdom, and that's ultimately under a righteous king. And we're going to see that, surely culminating in Jesus, obviously. So you have that going on, but the main point as far as the setup for David is all the way starting in Adam. He's leading all the way to David, who then is going to rise up, and he's going to be that righteous king. So I think that's what the story of the genealogies in chapters 1 through 9 is doing, is setting up the story of David. All right. How do the genealogies point to the Messiah? We talked a little bit about this in the intro last week as far as the Davidic covenant and how Jesus comes on the scene and he is the son of David. We've already talked about that this morning, as well as it traces the line of Judah, which Jesus is going to come through. So this is how it's promising that future ruler, is because that Judah promise is still alive. The scepter will not depart from Judah. A ruler will come from Judah, and so on. Okay, anything else on the genealogies before we get into chapters 10 through 16?
Along that line of pointing to the Messiah, but I had written this down. I omitted it a moment ago when I was refreshing my answer. But when you have the death of King Saul, Israel is in tatters. I mean, there's a lot of disarray there. And so here they are. It's not that they're on the brink of extinction, but they're not headed for greatness at that point.
Yeah.
And yet David is able to resurrect that nation, as it were. And so maybe an idea there is we have something of a resurrect. I mean, you can point to Ezekiel 37 as a dry bone.
Yes.
Literally the figure that God uses. I'm resurrecting this nation and bringing it back.
Yeah. I think it's a good way to put it. Absolutely, is that restoration. A second ago I said it was a new beginning for them. It is. It's that resurrection. So I like that. Okay, I will say here for 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, is it does help us to see that it is about Judah. It says, so all Israel was recorded by genealogies. This is 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 1. And behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel, and Judah was taken away into exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness. And so now they're coming back because of their repentance. Now the first who lived in their possessions in their cities were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. This is interesting because when you get to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 22, it says, now this is the very end of the book, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to complete the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah has come on the scene and he has made some prophecies. Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he had a proclamation passed throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may Yahweh his God be with him, and let him go up. And so we see in 1 Chronicles chapter 9 that the first who go up, the first who lived in their possessions in their cities, were Israel, the priest, the Levites, and the temple servants. So just some interesting, bookends here to the book of Chronicles. All right. With chapters 10 through 16, as already mentioned, a lot of this is going to remind us of our study of the book of Samuel, and which is going to cover really 1 Samuel 31 all the way through 2 Samuel chapter 6. You have the death of Saul all the way to the David carrying the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem to bring the presence of God to Jerusalem after he's already built his house. And his thoughts, we dealt with his thoughts about that, about how I have a house, it's beautiful, but the Ark of the Covenant is dwelling in this tent, and so he wanted to make a house. But I do see chapters 10 through 16 going along with the genealogies, and again, all about identity as God's people, reestablishing that identity, helping them to focus on what is the covenant as well as proper worship. Because if they are not united, if they're not obedient naturally, then they're not going to have proper acceptable worship. So in chapter 10, what you have going on is again that picture of Saul dying for his unfaithfulness. The Philistines are glorifying in that. They take his body, they put it before their idol within their temple. The men of Jabesh Gilead, they hear about it, they come, they get his body, bring his bones, and bury them at an oak or under an oak tree there in Jabesh. And they're doing that to ultimately honor Saul and his sons. And so that disgrace is not on the nation there with the Philistines. But that whole picture is one of the main things that we learn from chapter 10 is that this is God's doing. Yahweh did this to Saul because of Saul's unfaithfulness. And I think this is important too because we mentioned this a few times through our study of Samuel about how the narrator is constantly showing the innocence of David. He's not willing to put his hand against the Lord's anointed, which was Saul originally. He wants to strike down everyone else who tries to put their hand towards the Lord's anointed as well. David is innocent in all things. And then this makes it even clearer for us when the narrator of Chronicles says, Yahweh has done this. This was judgment against the unfaithfulness of Saul. As the reader reading this, we are reminded of that story, but we also recognize this is what's going to happen if we sin. This is the judgment, the hand of God in judgment against us. But along those lines, in connection to that is, yes, Yahweh did this to Saul, but now what is he doing to David? He's turning the kingdom over to him. David is rising up, and that is in accordance to his promises to Saul as well. So chapter 10 is all about what Yahweh has done, and what because of the unfaithfulness of Saul. Then when we get to chapter 11, and again, just kind of looking at this from a theological summary of just stepping back and seeing what is happening in this chapter that has to do with the big picture of Chronicles. So chapter 11, you have the kingdom is given to David. You have all of Israel being unified under David. I think that's very important that the narrator is already said that in chapter 9. He's already set that up in the genealogies of this unity throughout the genealogies. Then in chapter 9, he's going to say all Israel. Then in chapter 11, he's going to do that again. All Israel is coming under the reign of David. Along with that, it's not just Israel, but it's Israel's mightiest men are in support of David. And we're going to see more of that in chapter 12. But it just shows the legitimacy of David's kingship, is that Israel is binding themselves to David and the mighty men and the leaders. All of that's important as we're transitioning from one king to another king. There's all this support for him, and it's not just because they decided, oh well, David might kill us, so let's be loyal to this new king. No, their reasoning, their stated reasoning is because this is of Yahweh. So, again, stepping back, we're seeing chapter 10, Yahweh did this because of unfaithfulness. Now Yahweh is bringing about all this support for David because of David's faithfulness. And because he is the new chosen king. And, but despite all these mighty men, I think it's interesting in chapter 11 and verse 14, something we need to learn and they needed to learn, that Yahweh saved them by a great salvation. So he's mentioning all these mighty men, and yet it's still Yahweh working behind the scenes, delivering them, bringing about salvation. That is important because what have we learned all throughout Samuel is, hey, we got to have the ark, we got to have chariots, we've got to have horses, we've got to have alliances with other nations. Got to have all these things for us to be successful. And look at the list of all these mighty men who none of us are going to want to go up against. These trained people who can fight with the right hand and fight with the left hand. I'm not going to use the Princess Bride. I was about to, but I was like, I better not. Y'all, I just gave it away. But anyway, if you can fight with your right hand and with your left hand, you're not a warrior that you're going to, no one's going to want to go against that warrior. And yet it is Yahweh who saved them by a great salvation. He's always behind them if they are obedient to him. But then there's also this loyalty and bravery. So verse 19 of chapter 11, be it far from me before my God that I should do this. If you remember, he said, I would love to drink water from the well of Bethlehem. And so the three men go out and risk their lives. And he says, be it far from me before my God that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of these men who went at the risk of their lives? For at the risk of their lives they brought it. Therefore he was not willing to drink it. These things the three mighty men did. Notice the example of bravery and loyalty to David, willing to risk our lives to go and get this water for this king. As the exiles returning to the land, this list of mighty men and how they supported God's chosen king and how they risked their life for God's chosen king, and how they were brave and how they were devoted, that is how they were to be towards Yahweh. I risk my life for Yahweh. I devote my life to him. I lay it down. Complete devotion. And that is really going to lead us then into chapter 12, where you see allegiance over and over again. And I've actually outlined this because I think this is so important. If Chronicles repeats something, or any book for that matter in the Bible, if they repeat something over and over again, we as Bible readers have to stop and take all that in, because apparently God is trying to make a point. So in chapter 12, even before David is officially on the throne, he's still a fugitive, historically speaking. You've got these men who are coming in to support him, showing their loyalty to him, even of Saul's tribe. So even enemies, those who are hostile to the house of David, are coming and showing their support to him. You've got all the tribes mentioned that are, I hope that's the first bill, yeah. You got all the tribes mentioned that are showing their support. So again, that unity. But listen to this, verse 1, and I'm going to run through this real quick. Verse 1, you have mighty men who helped him in war. Verse 8, separated themselves to David. In verses 16 and 17, David talks about, if you come peacefully to me to help me, my heart shall be united with you. But if to betray me, notice that kind of allegiance language and betrayal, betray me to my adversaries, since there is no violence in my hand, may the God of our fathers look on it and reprove. Verse 18, they respond, Israel, even those who are his enemies, or the house of Saul, we are yours, O David, and with you, O son of Jesse. Peace, peace to you, and peace to him who helps you. Indeed, your God helps you. Verses 19 and 20, many men from various tribes defected to David. So they deserted their allegiance to Saul, and they came to David. Verse 22, for day by day men came to David to help him until there was a great camp like the camp of God. Verse 23, these are the numbers of the companies equipped for military duty who came to David at Hebron to turn the kingdom of Saul to him according to the command of Yahweh. Verse 29, of the sons of Benjamin, Saul's relatives, 3,000, for until now the greatest part of them had kept their allegiance to the house of Saul. Verse 33, of the tribe of Zebulun, They helped David with an undivided heart. Verse 38, came to Hebron with their whole heart to make David king over all Israel, and all the rest also of Israel were of one heart to make David king. And what did all that culminate in? Verse 40, there was gladness indeed in Israel. This is the picture of the returnees, of how they are to treat Yahweh. They are to be devoted. They are to undivided heart. They are to be loyal. Their allegiance is to be to Him, especially coming out of Babylonian captivity, where they have been under multiple gods. And what I think David is doing in chapter 16 with that psalm, as they sing this song after bringing the covenant, or the Ark of the Covenant, into the land, and they're praising God, and they're talking about His uniqueness, and they're talking about how He is the Creator, and He is the one who makes promises, and He is the one that's all powerful and all sovereign. David is pointing them to the one and true living God. And so this whole section is all about Yahweh, what He is doing, and then that contrast between the unfaithfulness of Saul and then the faithfulness of David, and then the faithfulness of what the people should have, or the kind of faithfulness that the people should have, not just to the anointed king, the chosen king, but to the chosen king of Yahweh. And if you love the king, as we learn in Psalm 2, if you kiss him and you pay homage to him, then you will be blessed. You will find refuge in him. And that's the picture you get in verse 40 of chapter 11. There was gladness indeed in Israel because we're all united under Yahweh. Then in chapter 13, they're going to correct that national failure that they have where the ark has been neglected. And they're going to bring it, and obviously they're going to create another failure, but they correct that in chapter 15, where they bring that about, and they do it in accordance to Yahweh's guidance, in accordance to the legal code of the Mosaic law. And once they do that, and they show that we can listen to God and we can do it His way, and they show repentance on a national scale and obedience to the Mosaic law on that same scale, when that happens, then the worship is organized, the worship is put forth, God accepts their worship, and they bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, and the song is played by the singers and the musicians, and all of Israel is blessing Yahweh for His goodness and for His blessings, and Yahweh is blessing the nation. And they are finding rest and peace. And that's the idea at the very end of chapter 16 when it says that they all went to their homes. What is that a picture of? It's a picture of rest, security, and protection. That's what God is doing to help them. Is they're not having to run. They're not being driven from their homes anymore. Instead, they're returning to their homes. And it's a picture of there is rest in the land, there is safety, there is peace. We are all united under Yahweh. Anything else before we close? Yes, sir.
Just real quick, for those returning, you mentioned in 13, 15, the failure that you said, just real quickly. In 13, you'll see that it looks like David inquires of the people, and in fact it says, find it real quick, let us bring the ark of our God back to us, for we're not required. So this was right in the eyes of all the people. And then we get to 15, and 2 or 3 times says they inquired of the Lord to do certain things, whether to go into battle, how to bring the ark back.
Yep. If you seek God's guidance, you will be blessed. Thank you.